Hey all! So it's been some time since I've made a video in this kind of style where I'm just sitting at my computer and talking. Bear with me. It's been a while because, of course, we were moving and my old webcam was having problems and my mic was having problems. I have a new webcam and a new mic, and hopefully that means that I can make more videos like this. I think that well, it's fun to make shorter form content, and that will continue to be filmed on like our nice camera. I think it's fun to be able to do like a long form discussion style video. And so you can kind of look at this video and other videos that I do like this as kind of like podcasts. There's not going to be visuals, so if you want to just turn me on in the background or use YouTube Music to just listen to the audio, that's a great idea. So today what I'm going to be talking about, and what I'm going to be kind of talking about in a series of videos that I'm going to be doing like this, is integration of Toronto's transit networks. Now, I went to a Toronto Regional Board of Trade event recently, which was talking about integrating the fares, and I'm going to be doing a video about that, so stay tuned for it. But it was talking about integrating fares across Toronto, and I thought, it's interesting. I want to have my own take on integrating Toronto's transit systems. And so, well, I'm not going to order the videos in any particular way based on how important I think the topics are. I'm going to make a bunch of videos talking about different kind of elements of integration. And for today's video, I'm going to start with talking about what I like to call physical interface. And by the way, I have notes up because there's like a lot of topics I want to talk about. So if you're wondering why I'm like looking around, that's because I'm looking at myself on OBS. I'm also looking at my notes to make sure I kind of cover the various points I want to discuss. Now, of course, me making these videos is pretty low effort. Okay, I maybe shouldn't have said that, but it's, you know, I get to just have a conversation with you. And so these kind of videos aren't going to impact my regular uploads or my upload schedule. It's just kind of nice to be able to have these more in-depth discussions. And so, again, feel free to put me in the background of whatever you're doing. All you're going to see is my face and this corner of the SkyTrain map. And so, without further ado, let's start talking about physical interface. So when I say physical interface, what I'm talking about is how the transit networks, particularly the rail network, because when you look at rail stations, there are stations. With buses, it's just a stop at a curb. Streetcars, often it's the same. But of course, with rail stations, you know, you actually have a physical station, like a pavilion, and all these different various things potentially. And so I think that talking about how our rail networks integrate is super important. Of course, our rail networks, on a per-line basis, carry an absolute ton of people, especially compared to a lot of surface transit. So I also think it's really important to talk about the rail network specifically because there's like a lot more transfer opportunity between regional rail, light rail, and subways. And so I think that that's why it's important to kind of talk about the stations and their physical integration, which is what I'm talking about when I say physical interface. I'm talking about the interface between different rail networks primarily. And so what I wanted to do was just highlight a bunch of the interchange stations that are currently either in the system or under construction. This is between Toronto's TTC and the GO Transit network. And I wanted to just kind of highlight my thoughts on each and what I think could be better about them, what I think they maybe do well. But without further ado, let's talk about Union. So Union is okay as far as integration goes. I'm going to talk a bit later about what elements of this physical interface I think are important. But Union is, again, pretty good. There's a direct path that you can walk to between the TTC and the GO trains. And so, again, yeah, not much to complain about. Though the one thing I think could be improved with Union, though, because of the way the TTC subway was originally built, this is a little harder. I think it's worth noting that often to have these better connections between different lines, you need to spend quite a bit of money. And so it's interesting to kind of debate, like, is the value there? I guess it depends. But for Union, I think it's a pretty high value station for the TTC and for GO, especially when you're talking about transfer volume. And so I think that if we're talking about how we could make that connection better, this is pie in the sky stuff, to be fair, but having the subway station be under the Bay and York concourses, perhaps like kind of directly in between them, would be pretty awesome. Being able to walk up, let's say, one flight of stairs and be in the lower Bay slash York concourses would be really great, and you would be able to pretty much directly walk up a couple sets of stairs and then be on a GO train. Now, of course, for that to be even better, what would be great is very long escalators that allowed you to ascend directly either from the level below the tracks and the platforms, or even directly up to reconfigured tracks and platforms. That would be like the perfect approach. But I think that in terms of having the subway just closer and more directly underneath the existing tracks for GO Transit, it would be a better connection, and it would make it feel a bit more like an integrated system, not just that here's the TTC facility over here, and then here's the GO facility over here. I think that a good example, if we're going to talk about that sort of integration, would be Sydney, with Sydney Metro and Sydney Trains. That's kind of what they're doing at Central Station in Sydney, and I think that it's a good model. I like it. So next up is Kennedy. So Kennedy is not terrible. It's pretty good. Of course, I complain about the lack of development and the fact that there's just parking lots all around Kennedy. But it's good. Having to go through fare gates, which is obviously a constant problem, is frustrating generally. Of course, that's going to require another type of integration to be dealt with, so we can probably address that in a future video. But other than that, the problem at Kennedy is kind of regarding the having to ascend so many levels to get to the GO platforms. You also have the fact that the GO station and the TTC subway station are they're not on top of each other, right? The GO station is kind of off to the side, which means that you potentially have to walk a couple hundred meters to the other station, which it's not terrible, and it is a weather protected connection, which is good. But if we're talking about optimally, that's not where the train station would probably be. It should also be noted that these kind of vertical ascents, they are something that's it's not unique to the TTC, but if you look at systems like the London Underground or the Moscow Metro, it's interesting too when you look at movies of metro systems where they have these giant banks of super long escalators. I think that's definitely a better solution than a ton of switchbacks and having to ascend a bunch of levels of stairs to get to your platform. So if you need to have this huge vertical separation, which hopefully in many cases you don't if you're doing things in a really smart way, if you need to, having it just be one long escalator is probably generally better than having to go up multiple levels, because it's more direct generally. Next up is Main Street. So Main Street is kind of a bad transfer, and I think that Main Street is one of the transfers where we might have to kind of just accept that it's difficult to make it a good transfer. The GO station and the Line 2 station are kind of some distance apart. You could improve it with a tunnel, but that's going to be pretty hard. You kind of have to go under the road, and there's utilities, and it would just be expensive. So I think that in this case, a good approach might be just a canopy. It's complicated from an organizational perspective because you have to deal with probably business owners, and you're putting stuff over the sidewalk. There's probably regulation and all this stuff. But you could really improve the connection in at least making it weather protected. So if it's pouring rain, having to go from a GO train to the subway or vice versa isn't miserable. And so I think that in places where a walking connection is the kind of only viable option, especially when you're not crossing a bunch of streets, it's a linear path, having a canopy would be nice. So that's Main Street. Next up is everyone's station they love to complain about not being properly integrated, Dundas West. So Dundas West is worse than Main Street because Dundas West as a station is more significant than Main Street. There's more services operating out of it, TTC-wise, but then it's also important because Bloor is more substantial than Danforth GO. I should have said Main Street Danforth, which is an issue we're going to talk about. Don't worry. With Dundas West, it's long been planned that there was going to be a tunnel between the GO platforms and the TTC platforms. They're much closer than they are at, say, Main Street, And there's actually an underground parking lot / mall, I believe, that they could be connected through that they aren't. So this one is kind of just, that's why people like to complain about it. But in terms of my thoughts on that, just having a tunnel is important, because even though like the canopy thing is an option here too, a tunnel is better because, you know, it's more temperate, it's less likely to be freezing. I mean, even if it's raining, if it's windy, a canopy isn't doing a ton to protect you. So having a tunnel is nice. Again, it goes to that point of integration, because once you have a tunnel, you can start thinking about like integrating the fare paid zones. Since we have fare gates, it's just something we've decided for the metro in Toronto, the subway. Maybe someday we might not have them in the subway, maybe someday we might have them on Go, but based on the way that's organized, just having a tunnel would make things a little bit easier. And so it's unfortunate that there's not a good connection there. If you're noticing a pattern, it's that there's not actually that many great connections on the TTC subway between the TTC again and Go, so keep that in mind. Next up is Kipling. Kipling I'm going to try to kind of go over quickly. It's more of a minor connection because it's on the Milton line, which is a peak hour only line on Go's network. The connection is at the end of the platforms, both the Go and the TTC platform. That's not great because Go trains are like 300 meters long, TTC trains are 140 meters long. So if you, in either case, you can have a 200-300 meter walk easily between the two platforms, which isn't, again, ideal, because if this is just an intermediate stop on your journey, you know, the time to walk that is not insubstantial, and so it just makes it so that transfers hurt more. And when transfers hurt more, instead of people being willing to say take 3 lines to go between a bunch of locations, now it's only 2 that they are willing to transfer between, and that kind of limits the accessibility and connectivity of your network. I should note though that at least Kipling is a weather-protected connection, which is valuable. So next up is Lansdowne. Now, if you haven't heard of Lansdowne Go Station, that's because it doesn't exist. So the Barrie line crosses the TTC line in a mixed connection right now. Sorry, I said TTC line, meant line 2, the Bloor Danforth subway line, which has most of the Go connections in the regular subway network that Toronto has right now, just because of the nature of it being circumferential. It goes east-west. Most of the Go lines kind of go upwards, you know, north-south, and so they interact with it. Now, Lansdowne it seems like might get built. The plans have been with the Davenport Diamond to build the Lansdowne Go Station, which would obviously be an asset to the local community. It seems like it might be integrated with a development, which is cool, but it is a little concerning to me that it seems like the development isn't really prioritizing, like I say the development, the construction of the station isn't really prioritizing a connection with the TTC. This is fine, but I think when you're building something greenfields, especially between line 2 and the Barrie line, which are both kind of pretty substantial lines, they're both going to have, well, I say both, the subway is frequent and the Barrie line is planned to be quite frequent in the future. And so having good connection between them is like pretty important. So if we're building a greenfield station, it's a lot easier to get that connection when you're constructing the station rather than having to install a potentially lengthy pedestrian tunnel or canopy in the future. And so I think that that's a little concerning to me. Next up is Oriole. Oriole, much like Kipling, serves a peak-only line. That's the Richmond Hill line. People, I think, question the value of having good connections, but at the end of the day, if you can have the good connection, why wouldn't you? Because it just would enable some trips to be better. I think they think of Go lines as only people from the suburbs going downtown, but imagine you're someone who lives at Don Mills Station, and assuming that fares are figured out and everything, wouldn't it be reasonable that you could get off at Oriole and easily get on a comfortable large regional train and ride downtown quite quickly compared to having to slog it on the subway? And you also have the fact that there's Wi-Fi and cellular data on the Go train. That would be a pretty reasonable thing to do if things were better integrated. But because Oriole is a couple 100-meter walk south of Leslie, it's not easy. Now there are plans, I think there's been discussion around moving Oriole GO station to be right next to Leslie, which would be great. GO stations on the peak-only lines in particular are pretty inexpensive compared to like a subway station, obviously, and so I think that moving to GO station would be a pretty good idea. So those are my thoughts on Oriole. Next up is Downsview Park. Now, Downsview Park on paper should be like this amazing connection, but it's not as good as you might hope. So the subway station is deep, which is just a byproduct of the fact that it's a bored tunnel. I think that honestly, in this area, the Toronto-York Spadina subway extension probably could have been at grade or above ground. I guess the crossing with the Barrie line wouldn't have been, but especially now that the airport seems like it's potentially going to be permanently closed, I think that having the subway run elevated and then have a really easy transfer down to the Barrie line would be great. But what we have is this really long vertical transfer between the subway and the Barrie line. It's about, I would say, as bad as it can get, with the stations being literally directly on top of each other, just because there's a lot of vertical distance. Now, to be fair, it is integrated, which is good, and I wouldn't complain about that in particular. But then the weird thing is that the GO platforms at Downsview Park don't have full canopies, which is a weird thing, because at Downsview Park opened after, let's say, Weston and Bloor stations, and even though I know the project for the TYSSE started before when those stations were completed, it's a little weird because you have this great connection, but then you kind of have to stay inside the station head house until the train arrives if the weather is bad, and then you have to like run out to the train because there's not good canopies. It's just the typical bus shelter type approach. And I think that weather protection is kind of a theme here. Toronto in particular is cold and wet for a lot of the year, and not having that good weather protection, it makes a lot of trips a lot less attractive. So I think it's important and a huge consideration for future connectivity at stations. Now, next up is Caledonia. So Caledonia is a future under construction-ish connection between the Barrie line and the Eglinton Crosstown. Now, I've talked before about how I think the Barrie line is kind of really cool because it links a lot of the various local rapid transit lines like Line 5, Line 1, Line 2, to the rest of the GO network in this kind of vertical fashion. But the annoying thing about Caledonia in particular is that despite the fact that it was kind of always included as part of the Eglinton Crosstown plans, it doesn't seem like it's actually going to open with the Eglinton Crosstown. It is still being built, but this is something else I think is very important, is that there's like a psychological factor. And if you don't open the line with a connection, I think it actually is a little less valuable, because when you open the line with a connection, like when a ton of people go and check out the line and share it on social media and tell their friends, they're going to be, it's in their mind that, oh, you can take the GO train to this station and get on the other line, and that's really cool. So when the connection isn't there, people just won't even notice, and it's like the station is right under the rail corridor, and yet a lot of people will be unaware that there's even a connection available there, which isn't helped by a lot of our other policies regarding how we communicate connectivity and stuff, but I think that's problematic. Ideally, it would be like our next station, Mount Dennis, where the station is built from the get-go as part of the Rapid Transit project. Now, Mount Dennis is it's good. Like, Mount Dennis is where we should be aiming for all of our connected stations. The station is like integrated from day one between the GO station and the Eglinton Crosstown, which is awesome. The platforms have canopies, which I go on and on about, but again, Toronto, having weather protection is really important. But yeah, and you'll notice something about the fact that with Mount Dennis and Caledonia, I just say Mount Dennis or Caledonia, something that's really important to notice is the fact that the names of a lot of stations aren't coordinated. So for Dundas West, that means something to a TTC customer, but many GO customers are probably like, what's that? Because they don't ever hear Dundas West when they're riding the train. They might, depending on if it's an Up Express train. But the point stands that by having separate names for the GO and TTC station, even if they're a short walk apart, it's one of these psychological factors again, where people don't make the connection in their mind that these stations are kind of one and the same, and that you're meant to be able to easily transfer. Now, it's good that generally when that transfer is easy, the station has one name, but still, I think in cases where you have like Dundas, West Bloor, it's worth just calling it one name. I think that some people do insist that, oh, it's not connected, it shouldn't have the same name, but I think that that kind of pedantic argument is why our network is so disintegrated, because we just don't focus on it enough. We have to be a little bit hopeful that it's going to be more integrated in the future, and calling stations by a single name is kind of one of the ways you can enact that, I think. Now, with all those stations out of the way, I want to talk about kind of my high-level thoughts on the whole physical integration side. Now, if you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and yes, I brought that up in this video of all things, what it basically says is that like people need food and shelter before they're going to spend time looking for social interactions or, you know, painting or creating art. It's kind of like you need to focus on these most fundamental factors first, and then once you've got that out of the way, then you can work your way up. And so I've kind of built up my own hierarchy of physical interface that talks about what like our baseline should be, and then how we work our way up to better and better connections between stations. I should note that as you kind of get more and more up the list, things get more expensive, especially if you're trying to make these connections after the fact. But yeah, let's go through it. So the first level is no connection at all. So that's a misconnection, like Lansdowne right now. So you have two rail lines crossing and there's no interface. And that's bad because that's connectivity that you've lost. Now, there might be some cases where like you don't need it. For example, if a line is, let's say you have two lines and they're separate, they cross and then they stay together for a while and then they split again. It might not make sense to have them have a bunch of interchanges between them, because as long as the distance of shared track is not that long, then there's no really connectivity benefit to having multiple interchanges, because people can easily travel to the single interchange and go back. But if systems are sharing a lot of corridor, then maybe you want to do other approaches like cross-platform and things like that. But yeah, misconnection is kind of the lowest tier. So from a misconnection, what you want to do is you want to move to a station in close proximity. So Dundas, West Bloor, Main Street, Danforth. I hate having to say so many words for these station names. That's kind of the next tier. So we have the stations, but they're not easily connected. And so I think that this level is actually, it's barely more valuable than the misconnection level. Yes, if it's convenient to walk, people might do that transfer, but they're definitely not going to do multiple of those transfers in a single trip. You also have the issue with weather protection, so in a lot of places, I'm from Toronto, but if you're in like, I don't know, southern China, the Middle East, Africa, then you have like a totally different problem, which is that with a lack of kind of shade and weather protection, you might actually be really hot. But at the end of the day, it's still the same fundamental problem. So that's kind of the next tier. The tier after that is a poor quality connection. So if you look at a station like Kipling, it is connected. You know, we can tick a box. Oh, you have a connection, but the connection is poor quality. Yeah, in Kipling's case, it's like there's a vertical difference. You have to go up and down, as well as having to walk quite a distance, as I was mentioning. And so the stations are physically connected, and it's good. People are mostly comfortable, but now they have to walk a pretty decent distance, and so that's not great either. So next up is the good connection. So this is Mount Dennis, basically. Mount Dennis is a good connection. People will be able to get off the train and go down a level, and they should pretty easily be able to get on a train in another direction. There's not much to say. This should be kind of our target, I think, most of the time. But to be fair, there is a level above this. So the good connection is expensive if you don't do it at the time of construction, because it means moving an entire station. Because the poor quality connection is just kind of the gap between the stations are close, let's build a tunnel, they're linked now, but for a good connection you have to have stations physically like on top of each other, or at least very close to each other. But with the great connection, even more expensive because it often requires realignment. And what that is it's cross-platform interchanges. And so this exists in a lot of places. I'm going to give you a few examples of places where it exists and why it's more complex. So with the cross-platform interchange, my first example is Lionel in Montreal. It's very convenient because you can literally walk straight across a platform to transfer trains. The reason that this is complicated is because if you can walk directly across the platform, that means that you've had to do some sort of vertical switch around, because typically if two lines are interchanging, they're crossing each other. It's not always the case, but it's quite usually the case. And so that means that for trains from one line to be able to be directly next to trains from another, especially if it's in both directions, like at Lionel, you have to do some twisting and interleaving, and so that's quite complicated. Now there are simpler versions of this cross-platform interchange. If you look at the Yamanote line and some of the local lines operating on the same tracks, what happens sometimes is there'll be like a flyover that swaps tracks around so that you can have that cross-platform interchange. But then you also have to consider the fact that when you're doing cross-platform interchange, you have to think about what the priority is, because obviously you can't have cross-platform interchanges between all sets of lines when you have two lines with two tracks each. And so you need to think about what is the most common path people are taking. The way this is dealt with in Montreal is that if you're heading downtown on the orange line and you're switching to the green line, you're probably wanting to head further downtown but just on the green line. So that's how it's dealt with at Lionel. Now, to be fair, we are trying to do this on the Ontario line, and that's a really good goal, I think. It is the good kind of cross-platform interchange as well, which is awesome to see, in that trains would be straddling the rail corridor, the Lakeshore East, and so what that means is people kind of get that directional transfer benefit. So if you're traveling west on Lakeshore East, you can transfer across platform to a westbound Ontario line train, which makes sense. Generally, that's probably the direction people will take. And so that's how great connections go. I should note that one line that you should really look into if you're interested in cross-platform interchanges is the Victoria line in London. They did a lot of reconstruction and interesting work so that when that line was constructed, a bunch of cross-platform interchanges were created. And so it's a good example to look into. Now, as I close out the video, I think it's important to note how unfortunate I think it is that a lot of people talk about this physical integration piece and the other integration pieces I'm going to bring up like they're not super important. Typically, they'll say something like, oh, like X number of people transfer between this GO line and this TTC line. Why do we need to spend money to make it a better connection? But the whole point is the reason people don't transfer is because of the poor integration. The fact that you can't use the same fare, the fact that the schedules aren't necessarily aligned, the fact that the station isn't an easy transfer. These all kind of come together and contribute to that poor integration, which leads to people not really considering our rail network in Toronto as one network. It's one factor in why people think of it that way, but starting to eliminate those factors to bring the network together so that people just naturally think, hey, I'll take the Stouffville line down to line 2 to ride it to Pape, or I'm going to ride line 1 from Yorkdale up to Downsview Park, and then I'm going to go to my friend who lives in Aurora. These kind of connections are something people will only start to think about when station connections are good, fares are integrated, services are integrated, and so that's kind of what we need to work towards. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, follow me on social media if you haven't already. I hope the audio quality, the video quality, and the light quality, because I got a light, was good for this video. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.